today's date is April 4th, 2023. My name is Sarah Smith. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am a professor of history at American River College. Okay, so let's start off by establishing some of the basics. What's your full name? What are your pronouns? And what is your date of birth?
My full name is Aiden Tyler Keller. My pronouns are he, him, his, and my date of birth is 9/6/1991.
So tell me a little about yourself. What are your interests and hobbies, and what do you like to do?
So a lot of my interests and hobbies pertain hanging out with my husband and my dogs. I like to play video games when I have the opportunity. I've really gotten into ceramics and photography.
What kind of ceramics do you do?
Um, I'm not so great on the wheel, so I kind of just do my own like slab sculpture work.
Okay, can you tell me how you identify with regard to your social identities, broadly speaking?
I identify as a white trans masculine man. I consider myself homoflexible and generally, uh, yeah.
Okay. Okay, so can you tell me a little bit about your coming out experience? What was the process like figuring out your identity?
So technically, I came out when I was 3 years old. I proclaimed that I was a boy, but that wasn't ever taken seriously. So when I was in eighth grade, around 13 years old, I came out as bisexual. The next year, I came out as a lesbian. And then when I was 16, 17 years old, I realized I was trans and started identifying as a uh, heteronormative trans man. Um, and then only around 24, 25 did I realize that I'm actually homoflexible and modified my preferences.
Can you say a little bit more about what that means?
So homoflexible is mostly I lean men of my own gender or even trans men, but I occasionally have a circumstance where I find myself attracted or romantically involved with a trans woman or a cis woman.
Okay, so can you say a little bit about what trans masculinity means to you? And how would you distinguish trans masculinity from cis masculinity, if you would make that distinction?
I would make that distinction. I think it took me a long time to come to that conclusion. When I first came out, I did everything I could to try and emulate cis masculinity, um, which included a lot of toxic masculinity that had been modeled for me as a child. Um, I would say that for me, my masculinity is very important to me. I know plenty of trans people, it's very fluid. And of course, there's non binary people, but for me, my masculinity and my binary gender identity is a huge foundation of who I am and how I perceive myself and let the world perceive myself.
And how would you distinguish that from cis masculinity?
I would say now that I've come to my own like comfort with it, it's more open. Um, it's a bit more tender. It's a bit more lenient in social expectations.
Mhm. So, what does it feel like, emotionally speaking, to have figured out your identity? And do you feel happy and empowered in your identity as queer or trans?
Yeah, I do. I didn't always. I think that there was a lot of shame around how I identified at first. I think that for a while, all I wanted to be was a normal man. And then I kind of came to realize that that wasn't quite the mold that I fit into anyway. Um, there's a ton of joy that comes with being who I am now, and there's also a mingling of fear.
Mm. So, if you feel comfortable talking about it, what was your life like with your family growing up?
So my family life was pretty nomadic. Not in the sense that we moved houses a lot, but in the sense that my parents divorced when I was pretty young. So there was a lot of bouncing back and forth from houses to houses. And then my parents divorced again, and so there was several houses I was bouncing back and forth from. And then by the time I was 10 or 11 years old, I was being parentified, so there was a lot of tension and responsibility.
Can you repeat or elaborate on what you just said? What was the word that you just used? Parentified?
Parentification.
Okay.
So basically, it meant that despite the fact that I was a child, I was put in charge of making sure my siblings got up for school, making sure they had lunches or dinners, or making sure the laundry was done.
Are you an older sibling or the
I'm the
oldest?
eldest.
You're the eldest. How many siblings do you have?
Uh, if we're not including like recent step siblings or step siblings that I haven't seen in a very long time, I have two younger brothers and a younger sister.
Okay. And are you in touch with your siblings?
Yes, I am in touch with the two brothers and the sister. I also have a half brother floating out there somewhere, a step brother floating out there somewhere, and a couple other step siblings that I don't have contact with.
And are you in touch with your parents still?
Very low contact.
So is that, can you talk a little bit about why that is, if you don't mind?
A lot of that stems with how I left home. Um, a lot of it stems with their own politics and their opinions on the queer community, um, and their inability to take accountability for my childhood.
Okay. So, where did you grow up again? I
I
didn't
grew up
ask you
in
that.
New Jersey,
New
Hunterdon
Jersey.
County, New Jersey.
And was it an urban area that you grew up in,
No, it
or?
was very rural. Considering we
Oh.
were so close to two major cities, it's very farmland.
And what did your parents do for a living?
My dad was a 911 dispatcher, and my mom's a NICU nurse.
And is that what they always did, or were there some transitions as you were growing up?
There was a lot of transitions before I was about 10. My dad was a diesel mechanic for a bit. He was an EMT in Newark for a bit. And my mom started with cosmetology, went to nursing school, was an ER doc, and then found her niche with NICU.
And when did she find that niche? How old were you at the time?
I was probably 8, maybe 8 or 9.
And so then did your situation, like, would you say that you struggled economically growing up at all?
So in hindsight, I can now say that we were comfortably middle class. Obviously, there was, the occasional struggle. But while growing up, I was led to believe that we were lower class than we were.
Um, and so you talked a little bit about how your family reacted to your coming out. And so is there anything that you would like to elaborate on about what that was like for you? And if you'd rather move on, that's totally fine too.
Yeah, I have no problem elaborating.
Okay.
So when I was 3, I started insisting I was a boy and was told that that wasn't possible. And so while I always did boyish things, everyone wrote it off as, oh, well, he's a tomboy. He'll grow out of it. It's a phase. Um, and then around the time I was 15 or 16, I met my first trans man in person um, at like a semi local queer youth group. And from then on out, like I knew, like as soon as I met him and understood how he identified his gender, I was like, yeah, that's it. That's exactly what I
So how did that feel for you?
am. It was really great to figure it out, and then it was immediately awful for the way that my family responded to it. I tried my best to keep it under wraps for a while, but then After I attempted to kill myself, I was assigned a state counselor. And while she was doing her intake with me, my mother was present, and she asked me how I identified, and I said, as a straight man. And the first thing my mom blurted out was, "No, you don't." From then on out, as it went through the family, there was a lot of, "You'll never be a real man, you'll only be a mutilated girl. Um, you only want to transition so you don't have to keep up with feminine hygiene standards." Um, the one family member that immediately took to it was my dad's mom. She heard it and like everything clicked into place for her. And she was always my biggest supporter.
So, did you have other people that you were in touch with aside from your dad's mom that were supportive of you?
My friends in school were very supportive. My girlfriend at the time replied with like, "Oh, I always saw you as a man anyway," which was a compliment for me. Um, but most of the adult figures in my life weren't.
Um, so, you mentioned to me previously that you had experienced homelessness, right? Does your family's reaction to you, your identity, does that have to do with why you were homeless, or what was that all about? Can you say as
Um,
much as you feel comfortable saying?
I think it plays into it a little. It was a myriad of issues. When I was a couple months into being 17, everything kind of came to a head with parent the parentification that I was experiencing. At the time, I was a senior in high school, and I was up 2, 3 in the morning trying to get my infant sister back to sleep. Um, and so after talking with my state-appointed therapist, she told me that there was no one that had to make me go home. Um, so I left. Once the dust settled and I was in a room with my parents, I wasn't welcome back. So I went and stayed while I was a minor with a friend's family. Um, and then once I turned 18, I was on my own, and I only had a high school education and was by myself, so I couldn't afford housing for several years.
How long were you homeless for?
Uh, from 18 to 22, 4 years.
Um, can you say a little bit more about what that experience was like? Or maybe stepping back one step, when you said that your family didn't welcome you back in the house, like why was that? Why do you think that was?
I don't fully know. So the meeting that I had with the school counselors and the school um, didn't involve the state because there was no abuse case. But once they sat down, my mom didn't do any of the talking. It was just her and my stepdad, and he just kind of kept repeating over and over again that I was disrespectful. I wasn't allowed home until I could learn to be respectful. Um, and once I got out of that meeting, my counselor turned to me and said, "I'm sorry I let him talk so much," but he kind of just kept digging his own hole.
So you were homeless for quite a number of years, right? What was that experience like?
Because I was in an urban conservative area, it wasn't to the extent that you see in urban areas. I wasn't like in a tent on the street. There was a lot of couch hopping, and there was definitely more than a few nights where I would just sleep in my car.
And were you working while you were homeless?
Yeah, yeah. I was never particularly good at holding down a job for very long, usually a year max. But I was working almost the majority of the time.
Um, what kind of jobs did you work? Or where did you work?
I did a lot of like minimum wage jobs. So in New Jersey, you can't pump your own gas. So I pumped gas for a lot of it. I was retail cashier for a lot of it. I did some food service.
And it just felt it was really hard for you to make enough money to be able to put a down payment on down on a place to rent. Is that
Yeah, once I did finally get an apartment, it was only because my grandparents gave me the down payment for an apartment. And even then, I couldn't afford to live on my own. So I had roommates.
So were you around other people who are also homeless?
Uh, no, I all of my friends, their parents had no problem with them staying at home, so basically crashed on their couches when I could.
And I can imagine being homeless, even if you're crashing on couches and you aren't, you said you're not in a tent, you weren't in a tent, but did you have any interactions with the police while homeless?
Um, Not quite. Back when I ran away, my parents reported me as missing, um, and so I was at my girlfriend's at the time in another state in Pennsylvania, and a state trooper came to the house, asked me, if I was a missing person, went to go run it, and it didn't come up. And so I went to my queer youth group as usual, and then by then the missing persons report had happened. So I had to be escorted back to my hometown by the police, sit in the police station until it could be decided what was done with me, because I knew at that point that no one could make me go back to my parents' house. Um, and then they eventually released me to my grandparents for a couple days.
And how do you feel like you were treated by the police?
There was a lot of belittling, a lot of like, you're almost 18, can't you just wait it out? A lot of, they're your parents. Um, it wasn't the most pleasant experience.
And is the way that they treated you, do you think it was shaped at all by the fact that you were queer or trans?
Probably underlying, nothing was ever said about it, but there was definitely a vibe. There was a mutual distrust between me and the police.
And why did that mutual mistrust exist?
It was a very small town. As I don't know about now, but at that time I was the only trans person, and there weren't really gay people either. So um, that definitely played a part in it.
Um, you said you were in a queer youth group. Can you talk a little bit more about that? What was that like?
Yeah. Through some friends, I found a queer youth group in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, which is about an hour away from where I live, that met every Thursday or something like that, or every other Thursday. It was held inside a church. It was called Haven, and it was maybe a collection of 10 or 12 kids between the ages of 13 and 20. And it was the one bit of community that was even available.
And did you like going to that
Yeah,
to
yeah,
that youth
it
group?
was really great. It gave me a better sense of belonging than like high school.
Were there other trans men in the group?
Yeah, there were trans men, there was trans women, there was a facilitator, like an adult facilitator that was a trans woman, and it was a really great resource to be able to see that we could exist.
So before moving on, is there anything else you wanted to add to what you've already said about your growing up experience that you feel like might be important to include?
Um, yeah, back before I kind of realized that I was trans, there was a constant battle from the time I was a young kid to wear feminine clothing, to wear dresses. My grandmother made dresses and was so excited to have a granddaughter to make dresses for. Um, and it was like a full out battle, to the point where my supportive grandmother, who didn't make dresses, would take me clothes shopping for school. And we would buy mostly boys' clothes, and then we'd buy one or two girls' clothes to put on top of the bag. So when my mom looked at it, she didn't see boys' clothes. And then I'd hide boys' clothes throughout my bedroom.
So did you have to dress in girls' clothes around your immediate family, and then whenever you could, you would dress in boys' clothes?
Yeah, there's still pictures from my mom's most recent marriage when I was 13, 14 years old. I'm in this really weird, like, crushed velvet red dress and these, like, 40-year-old woman pantsuit pants. And I look like a pilgrim because of the way the collar, like, sat. And I still can't look at those pictures. They're just hideous. I remember the fight having them.
And did they make you keep your hair long?
So when I was 12, my grandma took me to get a haircut, at her salon, and they had put us on opposite sides of each other to the point where the mirror was in the way, so we couldn't see each other. And when the salon lady asked what I wanted, I said, I want it short, like up to here. And she said, "Are you sure?" And I said, "Yeah." And then she was halfway through it when my grandmother got done with her haircut, and there was no going back. There was nothing you could do. You can't put the hair back on. And from then on out, I just controlled my own haircuts.
And was it the haircut that you wanted when
Um, yeah, I think looking back on pictures, because I was 12 and it was 2002 or whatever, uh, it's not the most flattering, but it gave me a lot of gender euphoria.
and I know I'm asking a lot of questions about haircuts right now, but where did you get your haircut?
Uh, my grandma would take me to salons until I was a little bit older, and then I started going to like uh, supercuts and like great clips and stuff like that.
Okay, so I want to transition, if that's okay, to talking a little bit more about class,
Hmm.
but in the present day. So, can you talk a little bit about what your class status is currently? How do you get by financially, and do you find it difficult?
Yeah, so my husband and I are lower economic class. It is difficult to get by. I haven't had a job really since the pandemic. I worked for the ARC Pride Center for a short stint, but that was about it. And despite looking, I've had a really tough time even getting in for an interview. So my husband Seth works three jobs. He works one full-time job. Um, he works a part-time job tutoring 4 times a week, and then he also does manuscript reading for a publisher.
And so, do you find it like difficult, week to week, month to month, to stay within what you have? Stay within your the money coming in?
Yeah, I mean most times it's pretty impossible. What little savings we do save up, we usually have to dip into pretty quickly, from uh, car repair expenses to unexpected vet appointments or unexpected doctor's appointments. A lot of our medical debt goes to collections because we just don't have 4 grand to pay the emergency room when I needed stitches.
Um, do you think any of the economic hardship you're experiencing has anything to do with being trans or queer more broadly?
I would say systemically, yeah. I know that a lot of trans and queer people do have a tougher time making their way up through the class system.
So, do the financial stressors that you do experience, does it ever make it difficult for you to concentrate on your coursework?
Yeah. Um, when I was in my 20s, my grandfather used to give me this like rehearsed speech of, if you want to be a man, you have to provide for your family. Um, and I don't feel like I'm doing that right now. And it causes a lot of anxiety, to the point where I'll put off doing homework because I'm just so obsessed with just trying to find any job, or just so depressed about the fact that I'm not contributing to the family.
Do you have any other sources of support? So, I know you said that your partner, you said he has three jobs, right?
Mhm.
Um, do you have any other financial support coming in?
Um, I pet sit occasionally. His parents will help us out every once in a while. We're currently renting our place from his sister, which she gives us a much cheaper deal than the rest of the area costs. So we have support systems. It's still just a struggle.
And do you get any support from the government or from the school?
Um, I get my tuition costs covered from the school. I did get a little bit of financial aid, but I haven't for the last year or and a half outside of the tuition. Um, I was on food stamps for a bit, but every once in a while we just bloop out of the qualification range and they drop us and have to go through the whole process again.
Have you accessed any of the support that's offered by ARC?
Yeah, I am a part of the produce distribution. It's a little hit or miss. A couple times it's been canceled now, which is difficult when you're relying on that. And now I have some doctor's appointments, daily doctor appointments that are getting in the way of me being able to go and pick up.
Do you think your current class status and maybe your class background plays any role in sort of how you feel in the classroom, your sense of belonging in the classroom?
No, I don't. I actually feel like the classroom is the one place where I can kind of forget about the fact that I'm poor. In the classroom, I feel like it's a lot more leveling.
Okay, so switching again, can you talk a little bit about your disabilities and how they impact you on a daily and weekly basis?
Yeah, so I have a chronic disability, a health disability. I am type 2 diabetic, and I have been for about 2 years. I also have learning disabilities. I'm dyslexic, and I have dyscalculia, which makes me have issues with letters and numbers. My husband's a special ed teacher, and he says I'm still the only person he's met where my dyslexia translates to verbally. So I sometimes have trouble communicating or using the correct words. Um, I've also been diagnosed with complex PTSD, uh, major depressive disorder, and I suspect that I have ADHD.
So could you talk a little bit about how your disabilities impact you on a daily basis?
Yeah, so the major depressive disorder has been a huge issue for a long time. Right now, I'm currently going through transcranial magnetic stimulation. It's a pretty intense alternative to treatment resistant depression. Um, it's a daily treatment, 20 minutes every day for like 8 weeks. And I go into the office, they strap a big magnet to my head, and it clicks at different, I don't know, magnet strengths. And it's supposed to help me create more neurons. Um, but it's exhausting. Like even now, I have a huge headache from my treatment earlier today. And 8 weeks is a huge chunk of my life. That's almost a half a semester. Um, the ADHD, I'm just constantly forgetting things. My time management is off. My executive dysfunction can get really bad. So that makes it difficult for me to keep up with homework assignments or keep my house in order, or even just make sure I go to the grocery store.
Do you feel like you have the support that you need?
To an extent, within ARC, for the most part, within my daily life, kind of. My husband's been fantastic. He's really like picked up the slack for me, even though he also struggles with depression. Um, I feel like my medical team listens to me pretty well, but my psychiatric team is still a little hit and miss on what they deem important.
So do you think that your transness, your queerness has shapes your experience with your disabilities and vice versa? You have to think about how those two intersect.
Yeah, I mean, I think that they kind of go hand in hand. I mean, most queer people that I know have some form of disability, whether it be physical or learning disability or a mental disability. Um, and I think that's just because we're more in tune to what's going on with us. I mean, there's a lot of introspection that comes with realizing that you're trans or non binary or some form of queer. And that forces you to be introspective about all parts of your life because you're looking at yourself like a Rubik's cube you need to solve.
Um, do you think sort of growing up, or your coming out experience, your relationship with your family, does that also sort of influence your disabilities that you have? Do you think there's any relationship between the two?
Yeah. So while I was in special ed for a little bit in elementary school, my mom, for whatever reason, didn't want me tested for some of the things that I needed to be tested on, and that made school a lot harder. I was a pretty piss poor student, frankly, for most of my educational career. Um, and not getting the help that I needed was a direct result of her indecision.
Do you think there are ways that ARC could do a better job of accommodating you and other students who have disabilities?
Yeah, I mean, there's always room for improvement. I think ARC has done a pretty good job. I think colleges as a whole need to start transitioning away from the expectation of memorization into application and understanding of material rather than do you remember what the book said.
Do you think that disability has been incorporated into the curriculum at all for any of the courses that you've taken? Have your faculty or have your professors been accommodating or understanding around your disabilities?
Um, yeah, I've had a couple choice comments that didn't necessarily sit right with me. I had one faculty member when he couldn't provide me with the quiet testing area that I needed in person. Um, say, well, why don't you just do it in the room for now, and we'll consider it practice for when you don't need those accommodations, which I felt was rich because I'll probably need those accommodations for the rest of my, you know, car- academic career. Um, when I do submit my disability forms, usually I'm met with acceptance or indifference, both which are fine with me. Um, and then that gives an opening to when I am struggling, I can reach out to my teacher. I have a line of communication established now.
Is there anything you wish your professors knew? Um, Anything you think you would want to tell them to help them be more inclusive of students with disabilities?
Um, I can't read 30 pages of a textbook in 5 days. I just can't. It's a lot. So it boils down to a lot of skimming, a lot of looking up answers. And I know that my husband and I have kind of discussed because he went to a CSU system that typically reading is assigned in a greater volume than the professors even expect you to complete. So if they could just like pull back that expectation a little and set realistic expectations, I think that would help not just students with disabilities, but the student body in mass.
Okay, so moving on, I want to talk a little bit about education, your educational journey in general. So you're a slightly older community college student at 32, right? You're
Yes.
32? Yeah. Can you tell me a little bit about your educational journey from high school to the present day, including why you decided to go to a community college in Sacramento?
Yeah. So I went to high school in Glen Gardner, New Jersey, which is a really rural area. A lot of my student body went like hunting on the weekends and drove pickup trucks and I don't know, other stuff that I don't really identify with. Um, Academically, it was a very good school. I think like within the top 50 within the state. Um, After I graduated, which because my senior year was so tumultuous, I graduated by the skin of my teeth. But after I graduated, I didn't go back to school. I thought about it a lot, but trying to survive was more important. Um, and then when I met my husband, who has a master's degree in creative writing, his older sister went to Princeton theology for her master's. Um, Her husband is getting a PhD in religious studies at UC Davis. It was a very academically enriched family, and I felt inadequate. And so when the pandemic hit and I lost my job, I just kind of like didn't know where to go. I didn't want to go flip burgers again. I was kind of over that. So one night, in like the middle of the night, I just signed up for community college classes and have been going ever since.
So you mentioned that you graduated from high school, but it was a difficult final year of high school. What was high school like for you in general? Where did you find support? Where did you feel like you were being discriminated against and harassed?
Yeah, so the student body didn't really harass me to my face. There was a couple kids, but for the most part, it was a lot of what was being said behind my back. The faculty was hit or miss at my high school. I had, a really great couple really great English teachers, mostly teachers in the humanities sect. Um, we did have a gay straight alliance. I think there was all of like 6 members, myself included. Um, when I ran for class president junior year, while the race was close, I know for a pretty definitive fact that I didn't win because everyone was super scared that the lesbian was going to make prom rainbows and unicorns. Um, Probably the biggest faculty adversity I faced was senior year. I wanted my name changed in the yearbook. I had been going by Aiden for like a year or more at that point. My friend was on the yearbook staff, and she went in through and edited all of the yearbook to have my name presented uh, until administration got wind of it. And before the final copy was sent, worked with the yearbook professor or yearbook teacher to change all of it back to my dead name. And when one of my friends confronted the principal at the time, his only response was, "Well, they can white it out if they want."
And how did you react to that? How did that make you feel?
Oh, it just made me feel like crap. It made me feel like I wasn't seen, like I didn't belong, like my identity wasn't valid.
So you came out as trans in high school, is that right?
Yeah.
What was that coming out experience like?
It's pretty great at first when it was just my friends, because they were all very accepting. My girlfriend at the time really like rolled with it, considering, you know, she was dating a girl when we started dating. Um, as as it kind of leaked through the school and my family, it got a lot more difficult. Um, it definitely created some internalized transphobia that I'm still chipping away at today.
Did you have the experience of being misgendered and people not recognizing your gender identity?
Oh yeah, totally, absolutely. For pretty much the entire last half of my high school career.
And so, given your experiences, can you say a little about why you think it's important for people to put the work into respecting people's gender pronouns?
It's important because it's validating. It wasn't an easy decision that I came to about being trans. I struggled with it, um, especially because there wasn't really any trans masculine representation in the media by the time I was that age. I think the only thing I knew was Boys Don't Cry, which isn't the most uplifting story. I think it doesn't take that much effort, frankly. I mean, if you can call someone named Richard Dick and not have an issue with it, like it shouldn't be hard to call who was once Levi, now Lavernia, you know?
Okay, so you go to American River College, right? Do you go to any other community colleges or is it just American River College?
Nope, just ARC.
Okay, and what are you studying or hoping to study?
I'm studying psychology. I'm waiting to hear back from Sac State on whether or not I got into their psychology program.
Is your plan to transfer in the fall?
Yeah, I should be graduating this spring with my AA in social sciences and my AA in psychology from ARC.
So you said you returned to school, or you went to started going to college when you were a couple of years ago, right? So around when you were 30.
Yeah, yeah, just
And
before.
so from 18 to 30, you were, so what was going on for you in that time period?
So I was homeless, like we talked about. I worked a lot of minimum wage jobs, even though I did job bounce a lot. I was also pretty deep into partying. I wanted to numb the pain that comes with being a trans person in society. And I think I did that pretty effectively.
And where were you living, I guess? Did you bounce around?
I bounced around a lot until I was about 22, and then my best friend, who now identifies as non binary, and I got an apartment together. Um, and then by the time I was 26, Seth and I had met, and we moved across the country to be closer to his family.
And that's how you ended up in Sacramento, of all places.
Yeah, that is not. I used to dream about going to California, and Sacramento was never really on that fantasy.
Um, okay, so you said you're majoring in psychology
Yeah.
and you're hoping to transfer to Sac State. So what are you hoping to do with your degree ultimately?
So the plan is to get my BA in psychology, go get my master's in social work, get my therapist license, and then become a therapist for queer adolescents and adults, with concentrations in trauma, gender studies, and psychedelic assisted therapy.
So my next question is how does your queerness do you think your queerness influences your choice, your career choice?
Yeah, it does. Obviously, I have had a lot of therapists in my life, and out of all of them, which probably exceeds 10, two of them have been some form of queer, which is just not enough. I had one therapist when I was 14 or 15 tell my mother that I was schizophrenic, and I now suspect that she thought that because I was talking about myself as a trans person without knowing it.
Um, so do you think you'll end up staying in Sacramento or
No, Seth and I do have plans to leave once I finish up at Sac State. We both just really miss the East Coast. We miss the vibe of it. Also, I did not know until we were leaving the driveway in New Jersey to come to California that the Central Valley is a bit of a Bible Belt in California. And I can't afford to live in Southern California.
what about San Francisco?
I definitely can't afford to live in San Francisco.
Um, one question I didn't ask you about was religion. Can you talk a little bit more about religion in general as it's influenced you, how it continues to influence you, sort of how it drives you or drives you away?
Yeah, so definitely in 2023, I'm not a huge religion fan. I personally identify with, or I'm a member of the Satanic Temple, which is just an atheist group. My husband is Wiccan. He really gets an important sense of spirituality from that, and I support him fully. I grew up Episcopalian, which is like Catholic light. Um, my parents weren't particularly religious, but my grandparents were very religious, and they were raising us a lot when we were younger. So most Sundays we were at church with them, um, and that fueled a lot of internalized hatred about my own self identity that took a long time to break away from. Uh, I still visit that church when I go back home occasionally. The pastor has only been anything like he's only been nice to me. He has only been accepting and affirming. So I don't think it was anything with his messages. I think, from what I can recall as a kid, he mostly preached messages of love and acceptance and understanding. but I think Christianity has had a bit of a taint around it, especially when it comes to homosexuality or being transgender.
Okay, can you talk a little bit about your experience taking courses at ARC that are either wholly or in part on queer and trans topics?
Yeah, so I have taken pretty much every course that ARC has to offer that is queer focused in any way. So I've taken introductory LGBTQ studies. I've taken gender and sexuality psych class. I've taken the LGBTQ literary class, um, and I eat them up every time. I love it. I feel really refreshed getting to hear my own stories and see my own experiences in my curriculum.
So if there were more courses offered, do you think you would take them?
Oh, absolutely. I wish that there were more before I left. Um, just the other day, Seth and I were up visiting friends, and one of them mentioned, despite considering themselves an ally, that they didn't know really anything about Stonewall. They know that it existed and that it had something to do with gay people. And I broke down the whole history of the Stonewall riots and why they came to fruition and how they, eventually morphed into pride parades and Pride Month.
So what has taken these classes done to your sense of sort of being seen, included, welcomed at American River College? And yeah, I'll stop there for that question.
I feel really seen. Like being able to hear stories from the 1800s from trans women having extremely similar experiences to me in 2023 is invigorating. It's enlightening, and I can't get enough of it.
So if there were more courses offered that focused on queer and trans topics, can you imagine the kind of course that you'd want to take, like in your ideal world?
Well, I'd love that if there was, a trans specific course, whether it be a social justice studies course or even a biology course. I think we hear a lot of rhetoric of there's only two genders because of biology, but that's literally the tip of the iceberg and not even the truth of it. And I think that that should be more ingrained in general education.
So have you taken courses not totally focused on queer or trans topics that you have felt have at least touched on queer and trans topics, and to what extent?
I've only taken one course that actually felt like it put it at the forefront of its curriculum. Um, Sociology, social problems. Uh, the rest of the courses, if they include anything about LGBTQ uh, studies, I guess, if they include it, it's tacked on at the very end of the semester, almost like an afterthought.
And what topics are usually covered
Um,
if they're tacked on? If you can remember anything specific, like of a professor tacking on LGBTQ topics.
Sometimes we'll touch topics of like, especially in psychology classes of sexuality, but it's usually pretty quick. It's usually there are gay people, there are lesbians, there are bi people, there are transgender people, and that's the extent of it. There's no going in deeper to ace or arrow people. There's no going into intersex or non-binary people, and I just feel like there's a lot more there that could be covered.
So, in addition to, so aside from just talking about the curriculum itself, what do you think faculty can do to make queer and trans students feel respected in the classroom? Do you have experiences with faculty that have put some effort into making trans and queer students feel respected? And, how so?
Um, Not really. If I bring up the fact that I'm trans in a discussion board or classroom, Maybe a teacher will comment on it positively, at least. But for the most part, no, it's not talked about. And because I pass as a cis man, no one discusses anything about it with me, you know?
What are some practices you think faculty can incorporate into their pedagogy that would make queer and trans students feel more included in the classroom?
I think a very simple verbiage shift to starting out unassuming people's pronouns, to starting out with maybe they, them, or more not, gender neutral pronouns would be a huge benefit. Um, I know that in the system you can change to your preferred name, but I still know that I've definitely seen like the occasional student be called out by their dead name, especially if they need uh, services like from the disability department or from the admissions department. They're not going to call you by your preferred name because they legally have to use your legal name. It would be a huge help if there were services to make it easier to change your name that ARC offered legally through the court system, even if it's just pulling in some paralegal students to help sift through the paperwork, or helping with a name change grant that you can apply for or scholarship that you can apply for. Um, and having more inclusive knickknacks, I guess. If I saw, pronoun buttons at the student center, or bigger Pride Center awareness events.
So you said that you said that you pass generally, and so have you had any experiences being misgendered at all?
Not a long time.
Okay.
Usually, when people find out I'm trans, they give me the backhanded, "Oh, I couldn't tell." That was the point.
So under what circumstances do you feel comfortable coming out as trans in any random classroom?
It's usually the more humanities-based classes that I will come out. I didn't see any point coming out in my statistics class. Um, I have a lot easier time doing it on online classes than I necessarily do in person. And even that, with the political climate that we're going under, I had started becoming a lot more open and proud of my trans identity, and now I'm starting to pull back a little for my own safety.
Oh, can you expand on that a little bit? Like, so what do you mean in terms of when you talk about the larger political context and what's going on?
Yeah, so there's a lot of anti-trans bills. I think it was like a Republican convention. One of the speakers called for trans eradication. Other people are saying that we should be jailed or camped. Um, it's a lot of very familiar fascist Nazi rhetoric that strikes fear into me. Seth and I have sat and had conversations of when do we know it's time to leave? How do we know it's too late to leave? Where do we go if we leave? Can we afford to leave? Um, so seeing more solidarity, both within my community and within my community college, would help put me at ease, I think.
What do you think that would look like?
It's hard to say. I know that the colleges can't infringe on free speech, but seeing Christian protesters protesting about abortion or trans rights or gay rights is alarming. Um, it's cool to see the queer student body amass counter protests, but uh, I don't really know where we go from here.
So, do you think in college you've ever struggled academically as a queer and trans person?
Um, if I did, it didn't show. You know, I've got a 3.7 GPA that I'm really proud of, that I worked really hard for. Um, so I don't think it necessarily reflected, but I did struggle, and it definitely did relate to being a queer trans person. You know, whether it's stress from the political strife that's slowly happening, or stress from transition medication. It's been difficult to get consistent testosterone, and I think those little things add up.
Why has it been a struggle getting testosterone?
So testosterone's a controlled substance in the United States, so I can only get 1 month's supply at a time. Um, Insurance approved my testosterone, but it didn't approve Seth's. So my doctor did a little workaround to make it so we could both have access to it. But sometimes the pharmacy has a supply shortage. Sometimes my doctor, who is trans, is only in twice a week, so sometimes I need refills and I won't get a refill for a week or more. Which, you know, that's hormones in my body that I need to keep those levels pretty regular daily. So those dips and divots that make it hard to get it can affect how I feel and how I interact with the rest of the world. Before I found this doctor, um, I was going without my testosterone pretty regularly. Uh, my only option was Planned Parenthood, and it wasn't a very reliable option.
So you said, I mean, clearly you're doing really well in school right now. Do you think, when you imagine classrooms being more trans and queer inclusive, do you think you can imagine sort of like thriving in a different way than you do sometimes in the classroom? I mean, you mentioned that uh, you're not always out, for instance, as trans, as queer in the classroom. Do you think if we had a culture in our classrooms that was more trans and queer inclusive, that might change for you, or might have, created a different sort of atmosphere for you that would have made you more comfortable being out?
Yeah, I think so. Um, I think it's slowly dawned on me that most of the trans people I know realized that they were trans because they met another trans person or saw another trans person. And I think that visibility is really important to help make trans people not feel so alone in their struggle. Most of the trans representation that I saw in media until about, you know, 5 years ago or so was always the butt of a joke, um, or it ended in their death. You know, it was always either not taken seriously or dramatically devastating. And so I think, especially now with like technologies like TikTok, where you can see people in real time, um, I've noticed a trend of younger trans people that see older trans people and expressing a sense of relief. Um, of I've never seen a trans person with gray hair before. Like, I didn't know we got that old.
Do you know if there are any trans faculty or trans staff at ARC?
Not that I know of, but as much as I feel that visibility is important, it's also none of my business.
Do you think it's important to have more visible trans and queer faculty?
Yeah, within their comfort level,
Yeah, within.
absolutely.
Finally, a very general question, but what motivates you to learn in the classroom?
Um, I really just like learning, especially in this subject areas that really interest me, like psychology and social justice and sociology. I just can't get enough of those topics. There's so much more to learn. Um, there's so much more to research. There's so much more to expand upon than what the general public knows or what I knew before going into community college.
So I know that you worked at the Pride Center. Um, what was that experience like?
It was not the best experience. I was reached out for the position. I was really excited to start the position. You know, the idea of having a safe space for queer students, resources for queer students, um, doing research projects and advocating on behalf of queer students really excited me. But then ARC, as much as they say that they're committed to the idea, doesn't actually put their money where their mouth is. I think they say it to look good more than actually wanting to invest in queer students. Um, I was hired. It took probably a month and a half before I was actually officially hired. And thankfully, my facilitator advised for back pay during that time because I did jump on board doing tasks during that time. Um, I worked there for maybe 3 months before that coordinator wasn't offered enough hours to continue working there and putting in the level of care that they wanted to and felt they needed to. And then I was pretty directionless because I didn't have a boss for a couple months. And then there was an interim boss, and we got 1 day's notice that we were going from remote to in person. And that was kind of like the final straw of working for them. Just the lack of courtesy. I honestly wasn't even getting paid often enough to start driving to ARC. I live in South Sac. That's a whole 20, 30 minutes away. To go every day for minimum wage wasn't really realistic.
So have you ever felt harassed or discriminated against because of your gender identity and sexual orientation while in college?
Not personally, again, because I do pass pretty well. You know, the receding hairline and the beard doesn't make people think that I'm trans. Um, but I would say I've watched a lot of people say derogatory things about the trans community or even perhaps about another trans student that makes me uncomfortable.
Have you used any of the support services for queer and trans students at ARC?
Not really. I'm a part of the Los Rios district Discord for queer students, so that gives a little sense of community, but otherwise, I haven't really taken advantage of anything.
So, how important do you think it is for the Pride Center to be fully staffed and funded? And what would that mean to you? What does that mean, fully staffed and funded?
It's deeply important to me. Fully staffed and funded would be having multiple student workers and faculty advisors. Fully funded would mean being able to put on events for queer students, like a queer prom, um, food drives, clothing drives, craft opportunities, activities, and other ways to build community within the community college.
So, how important do you think community is for queer and trans students to feel like they belong?
It's deeply important. Unfortunately, I've always had a big struggle in finding queer community, let alone finding my niche in queer community. Um, and it takes a mental toll being in cis heteronormative circles all the time.
So, if you could find community, what kind of community would you look for specifically?
Um, I'd like to have more trans mask community and trans community in general. The trans community just understands some of the struggles that I've gone through and currently deal with better than um, most of the cisgender community. Um, it'd also just be nice to have some queer diversity. Um, I would say that one of the biggest issues with the queer community is we kind of go into our little pockets. You know, the gay men don't really hang out with the lesbians very much, and the lesbians and the gay men don't hang out with the trans community very much. And that makes some internalized phobias pervasive in the queer community.
So you mentioned the Discord channel. Is that where you've primarily found community? Have you found community in other spaces on campus and in classrooms?
Yeah, it's mostly been the Discord. Because my depression had a huge flare up, I kind of haven't really been active in it in the last month or two. Um, and I think I am missing that community. I just don't have the mental ability capacity to give it attention right now.
So, what do you think the college should do to make trans and queer students feel more included on campus in general, structurally in terms of its policies and so on?
Um, I think they need to work on their need to dead name students within admissions and financial aid and DSPS. I think that there should be more faculty training on the queer community, specifically focused on queer curriculum and queer students and how to support them. Um, yeah.
Do you think that there's a need for more all gender bathrooms at ARC and perhaps at other colleges?
Yeah, definitely at ARC. I think there's maybe three or four. Um, and I've heard plenty of students complain that they're hard to find or they're locked. Um, and they are pretty recessed. Um, and I don't feel like it's that big of a transition to make. That was one of my short-lived research projects within the Pride Community Center, was to discuss with the board how we could expand gender inclusive bathrooms, and one of the ways would just be changing signage. Um, this is a all gendered bathroom with urinals, and this is an all gendered bathroom without urinals. It feels pretty simple.
And why do you think it's so important to have more all gender bathrooms specifically?
Um, well, gendered bathrooms really throw a loop for non binary students, or gender nonconforming students. Um, I also feel like it can be a safety issue at times. I know plenty of students that just try their best not to go to the bathroom while they're on campus, which feels extremely inhumane. Everyone has to use the bathroom. It shouldn't be a second thought.
So you've spoken to this a little bit already, but how do you think our campus, how do you think ARC reinforces the gender binary, and what would you like us to do to challenge the gender binary to be more inclusive of queer and trans students?
Well, there's no safe space for non-binary or trans people to get changed for PE. There's a women's locker room and a men's locker room, and that is it. Um, and then, of course, we've talked about bathrooms, how there's only a handful of all gendered bathrooms. Um, Even sports teams. I mean, you've got girls soccer and men's soccer, but uh, I just don't feel like it'd be that big of a deal to have just a soccer team.
Um, so finally, I think in general, what makes you excited about being a college student?
Um, a lot of what pushes me forward is knowing that I have the opportunity in front of me to be the kind of person that I could have used when I was a kid. Um, the idea that I can do some groundbreaking things with queer and trans patients, with case studies, with just the networking that I do. I don't think in my wildest dreams I imagined doing a documentary about being queer. Um, yeah.
I said finally, but I'm going to take one step back.
Okay.
um, so Sac City College has a counselor that specializes in serving queer students, but ARC, to my knowledge, does not. Do you think one change? What do you think it would be important to have a mental health counselor at ARC?
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, disproportionately queer and trans people have more mental health illness. And I would say even when you don't, it's a struggle to carry that load all by yourself of figuring yourself out or dealing with the social pressures. Or I know plenty of queer students in the Discord have a lot of friction with their parents about their transition or their identity, and just knowing that there's a safe, confidential resource available would make all the difference. I mean, occasionally it's the blind leading the blind when it's, these kids who haven't experienced safe and loving environments advising other kids on how to deal with their unloving and unsafe environments.
Is there anything that occurs to you in particular that ARC and the district more broadly could do to support queer and trans students who come from low income backgrounds?
Yeah, I think having health services, free health services would be, or low cost health services would be a huge help. Um, I mentioned it before, but having help or financial help or legal help on document changes, um, safe spaces to get changed so you can just do your PE class because that's a general ed requirement. I just think that there's a lot more that can be done, and there's probably more that I even haven't thought of.
Okay, now finally for real, anything that you would like, anything in general you'd like to add or questions you'd like to return to?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, well, thank you.